Power doesn't reveal who you are until someone refuses to be controlled by it. The courtroom doors closed with a quiet echo as Richard Hale adjusted his cufflinks. The verdict still hanging in the air like a victory no one dared question. Another win, another signature, another life quietly undone by a contract no one fully understood, and somewhere in the back row, unnoticed, a young woman had watched it all without a word, her eyes steady, memorizing every clause, every pause, every mistake he didn't realize he made. Weeks later, the same man stepped into a Manhattan restaurant where crystal glasses clinked softly under warm light. His presence bending the room as usual, conversations lowering, eyes turning, because men like Richard didn't enter quietly. They arrived like a statement. And tonight, he was bored, which was far more dangerous than angry. Emily Carter stood near the counter, tying the string of her apron with calm precision, her blonde hair pulled back, her expression neutral. The kind of face people forgot seconds after looking away. Exactly how she preferred it. She moved with quiet efficiency, pouring coffee, clearing plates, never rushing, never lingering, just present enough to do her job and invisible enough to avoid attention. When Richard sat down, he didn't look at her at first, just placed his phone on the table, checked his watch, a $40,000 piece of Swiss engineering catching the light. Then finally, a glance, brief, dismissive. Coffee. Black, he said, already scrolling again. Emily nodded once. No smile. No extra words. Just action. And if you've ever watched someone like that and wondered what they were really thinking, you're not alone. Some people in the room that night would later say there was something about her, something you couldn't quite explain, and maybe that's why moments like this matter, because the quiet ones often carry the loudest truths. But no one in that room knew that yet. She returned with the coffee, setting it down with steady hands. And that's when Richard finally looked at her. Really looked, just for a second longer than necessary. Something in her composure not matching the uniform, not matching the role. But he brushed it off. People always tried to act like more than they were, and he had built a fortune proving them wrong. Then, almost casually, he reached into his leather folder and slid a document across the table toward her, the paper stopping just inches from her hand. "Do me a favor," he said, his tone light, but edged with something else, something testing. "Sign that, and I'll give you $10,000. He leaned back slightly, watching now. This was the part he enjoyed, the moment where need met opportunity, where people revealed themselves for what they really were. Emily didn't react immediately, didn't reach for the pen, didn't even look at the number. Instead, her eyes moved across the page, slow, deliberate, one line at a time. The noise of the restaurant fading into the background, a quiet forming around the table that no one could quite explain. Richard's smirk held, but just barely, because something about the way she read that contract didn't look like hesitation. It looked like recognition. Richard did not interrupt her this time, which was unusual, because men like him rarely allowed silence unless they controlled it. Yet here he was, watching as a waitress traced legal language with her eyes like she had seen it before, his fingers tapping once against the table, then stopping, because something about her pace unsettled him. It was not slow, it was precise, like she was not reading to understand, but reading to confirm. Emily turned the page slightly, just enough to catch the overhead light, her expression unchanged, but inside, memory aligned with ink, clause structures, liability shields, the familiar architecture of contracts designed to look harmless to the untrained eye. She had seen versions of this before, in rooms much quieter than this one, where decisions carried weight far beyond a dinner check. Around them, the restaurant continued its quiet rhythm. Glasses touched, forks met plates. But a few nearby tables had started to notice, not because of what was said, but because of what was not, because a man known for controlling every conversation had gone completely still. "It is straightforward," Richard finally said, his voice calm, almost bored, but there was a subtle edge now. Just a standard acknowledgement form, nothing complicated. He leaned forward slightly, watching for the usual reaction, hesitation, confusion, maybe a nervous smile. But Emily did not give him any of that. Instead, she lifted her gaze from the paper and met his eyes for the first time long enough to register something different, not defiance, not fear, just awareness. "Standard," she repeated, softly, as if testing the word itself. Then her eyes returned to the document, her finger pausing at a single paragraph, the air between them tightening, not dramatically, but enough to shift the balance in ways no one could yet name. Richard noticed it now, that small pause, that exact point where her attention anchored, and instinctively, he followed her gaze to the line she had stopped on, a line buried deep enough that most people would have missed it entirely, and for a brief moment, something unfamiliar crossed his mind, not doubt, but curiosity sharpened into focus. Emily adjusted the paper, aligning it neatly with the edge of the table, a small, controlled movement that felt more deliberate than necessary, as if she was setting the stage for something neither of them had fully acknowledged yet, and when she spoke again, her voice remained level, almost gentle, but the words carried a weight that did not belong to a late-night shift. "Do you always include this clause in your agreements?" she asked, without accusation, without tone, just a question placed carefully between them. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in recognition that the game had shifted, because that was not the question of someone tempted by $10,000. That was the question of someone who understood what was at stake, and for the first time that evening, he did not answer immediately, because somewhere beneath the polished surface of control, he realized this was no longer a simple test, and whatever came next, he was no longer the only one asking the questions. Richard did not like unanswered questions, especially not from someone in a uniform he had already categorized, yet he found himself studying her differently now, not as a server, but as a variable he had not accounted for, and that alone made him uneasy in a way he would never admit, because his entire world had been built on predicting outcomes, on reading people within seconds, on knowing exactly how far to push before they gave in. Emily, on the other hand, had spent years learning the opposite, not how to control a room, but how to disappear in it, how to listen without being noticed, how to let people reveal themselves without interruption. It was a skill she had refined long before she ever stepped into a courtroom, back when she realized that the loudest person was rarely the most powerful, and that truth, once understood, was difficult to unlearn. She kept her hand resting lightly on the edge of the contract, not claiming it, not rejecting it, just holding her place, as if the paper itself was not the point, as if something else beneath it mattered more. "It limits liability in a very specific way," she added quietly, not looking up this time, her tone neutral, almost observational, but each word landed with careful precision, and Richard felt it, not as a threat, but as a shift in gravity, subtle, but undeniable. He leaned back slightly, reassessing, his mind moving faster now, scanning for patterns, for tells, for any sign that this was a bluff, but there was none, no nervousness, no attempt to impress, just calm, controlled awareness, and that was what unsettled him the most. Because people who pretended to know things always gave themselves away, but people who actually knew did not need to prove it. Across the room, a couple at a nearby table had stopped mid-conversation, their attention drawn not by raised voices, but by the absence of them, by the strange stillness that had formed around a single table where nothing dramatic seemed to be happening. Yet everything had changed. Richard's fingers brushed against the edge of the document, pulling it back an inch, not enough to reclaim control, just enough to test the space between them. "You read contracts often," he said, the statement disguised as a question, his eyes fixed on her now, searching, measuring, recalibrating, because whatever this was, it no longer fit into the simple narrative he had created when he walked in. Emily finally looked up again, her gaze steady, unhurried, and for a moment, something passed between them that had nothing to do with money or signatures, something closer to recognition, as if both of them understood that this conversation had moved beyond its original purpose. "Not anymore," she replied, and there was something in those two words, something unfinished, something that hinted at a past she had chosen to step away from rather than lose, and Richard caught it, not the full story, but enough to know there was one, enough to realize that whatever role she was playing now, it was not the role she had been trained for. The air felt different, heavier, in a quiet way, and for the first time that evening, Richard did not feel like he was conducting a test. He felt like he had stepped into one, and he was no longer certain he understood the rules. Richard let the silence stretch, not out of patience, but calculation, the kind that had closed deals worth hundreds of millions, the kind that usually made people uncomfortable enough to fill the gap themselves. But Emily did not move, did not fidget, did not offer anything he had not asked for. And that alone disrupted the rhythm he relied on, because silence, when it was not his, felt different. He leaned forward again, this time slower, more deliberate, as if adjusting his approach without admitting it. Then why stop? He asked, his voice quieter now, less performative, more precise. Because if she had once been familiar with contracts like this, she had not been a beginner, and people did not walk away from that level of skill without a reason. Emily's fingers lightly tapped the edge of the paper once, a small, almost absent gesture, but it marked a shift in her thoughts, a line between what she would say and what she would leave unsaid. Some professions, she replied, her voice even, teach you how people think. A pause, just long enough to let the idea settle. And sometimes, you learn more than you want to know. She did not elaborate, did not soften it, just placed the truth there in its simplest form. And something about that answer lingered, not dramatic, not defensive, just final in a way that suggested the rest of the story was not for him. Richard studied her more closely now, not her uniform, not her posture, but the restraint in her words, the discipline it took to say exactly enough and nothing more. That was not something you learned in a diner. That was something you earned somewhere else, somewhere structured, somewhere high stakes. And for a brief moment, an image surfaced in his mind, a courtroom, controlled, strategic, every word measured, and the thought unsettled him more than he expected. He shifted the contract again, this time pulling it fully back toward himself, not out of withdrawal, but reconsideration, as if the document itself had become less important than the person across from him. $10,000, he repeated, slower now, testing the weight of it in the new context, for a signature that does not matter. But even as he said it, the confidence behind the statement felt thinner, because if it truly did not matter, he would not have placed it there in the first place. Emily's gaze dropped briefly to the number, then lifted again, and for the first time, there was the faintest hint of something in her expression, not amusement, not judgment, just recognition, as if she had seen this exact moment play out before in a different setting, under different lights. Everything matters, she said quietly, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any argument, because it did not try to convince him, it simply existed. The air between them shifted again, tighter now, not hostile, but charged in a quiet, controlled way, like a conversation that had moved beyond surface level without either person announcing it. And around them, the restaurant continued, unaware, or perhaps just pretending not to notice, because moments like this did not need an audience to feel significant. Richard exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, and for the first time since he sat down, he was not thinking about the outcome of a test. He was thinking about the possibility that he had misread the situation entirely, that the role he had assigned her was incomplete, and that realization, subtle as it was, began to shift something deeper, because if he had been wrong about her, even slightly, then the rest of the equation was no longer as predictable as he preferred, and in a world he controlled by certainty, that was where the real tension began. Richard's gaze lingered on her longer now, not with dismissal, but with a sharpened focus that rarely failed him. Yet this time it did not give him clarity, it gave him resistance, because the more he studied her, the less she fit into any pattern he trusted. And that was when he made a decision he had not planned when he walked in. He reached for the pen himself, not to sign, but to tap it once against the paper, a subtle signal, a shift from testing to probing. "Tell me something," he said, his tone lower, more direct. "If it matters so much, why are you standing here?" His eyes flicked briefly to her apron, then back to her face, not mocking, but genuinely questioning now, because the contradiction no longer made sense to him. Emily did not answer immediately, and this time, the pause carried something different, not hesitation, but choice, as if she was deciding whether the next words were worth the consequences. The restaurant noise blurred again, fading into a distant hum as her attention narrowed. Then, without breaking eye contact, she reached into the small pocket at the front of her apron, not hurried, not dramatic, just a simple movement that somehow felt heavier than it should, and placed something on the table beside the contract. It was not large, not flashy, just a plain white card, edges slightly worn, the kind of thing most people would overlook, but Richard's eyes dropped to it instinctively. And for the first time that evening, his reaction was not controlled. The name was simple, the text clean, but the meaning behind it landed with quiet force. Emily Carter, attorney at law, inactive status noted in smaller print. Beneath, and for a fraction of a second, something inside him recalculated faster than he could contain it. Because this was not a bluff, not a guess, not a coincidence. It was confirmation. Emily did not push the card closer, did not explain it. She simply let it exist there between them, as undeniable as the contract he had placed moments before, and when she spoke again, her voice remained steady, unchanged. I used to stand on the other side of tables like this, she said, not with pride, not with regret, just with truth. And I learned that people rarely read what they sign. A slight pause, her eyes flicking briefly to the clause she had stopped at earlier, then back to him. Especially when they think they are in control. Richard leaned back slowly, the pen still in his hand, but forgotten now, because the game he thought he was playing had shifted entirely, not just in rules, but in stakes, and for the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not fear, not yet, but awareness. The kind that comes when you realize you have underestimated the only variable that matters. Around them, nothing had changed. The same lights, the same quiet conversations, the same clinking glasses, but at that table, the balance had tilted in a way no one else could see, because the contract was no longer the center of the moment. She was, and Richard understood that now. Understood that whatever came next would not be about $10,000, or signatures, or even the document itself. It would be about who understood the situation better, and as his eyes moved from the card back to her face, he realized something he had not considered when he walked in. He was no longer testing her. He was trying to catch up. Richard did not touch the card, not yet, as if doing so would confirm something he was not ready to fully accept, but his eyes kept returning to it, drawn by the quiet certainty it represented, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the structure of a situation shifting beyond his immediate control, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough to matter. He exhaled slowly and reached for the contract again, this time not as a test, but as a problem to solve, his fingers flipping back to the clause she had pointed out, reading it again, more carefully now, and what had once looked like a harmless safeguard began to reveal its sharper edges, the kind that could turn if challenged in the right context. The kind that depended entirely on the other person not noticing. You are suggesting this is enforceable against me, he said, not looking up, his tone measured, but there was a new layer beneath it, something closer to caution than confidence. Emily shook her head slightly. A small movement, controlled. I am suggesting, she replied, her voice calm, that it is not as one-sided as you think, and that distinction, subtle but precise, landed harder than any direct accusation, because it did not attack him. It reframed the entire situation. Richard's jaw tightened just enough to notice, not out of anger, but concentration, the kind he reserved for negotiations where a single detail could cost millions. And now, unexpectedly, that same focus was directed at a conversation that had started over coffee. He set the pen down. Finally, a quiet admission that this was no longer about getting a signature. Who wrote this? He asked, his eyes lifting to meet hers again, searching now not for weakness, but for alignment, for any indication that she was connected to something larger than this moment. Emily's expression did not change, but there was a slight shift in her posture, almost imperceptible, as if the question itself carried weight she had anticipated. Someone who understands leverage, she said, and for a second, the words hung between them, layered with more meaning than they appeared to hold, because leverage was not just about contracts. It was about people, about timing, about knowing exactly when to speak and when to remain silent. A server passed nearby, glancing at the table, sensing the tension without understanding it, the kind of moment that makes people curious enough to watch but cautious enough to stay out of it. And if you were sitting there, you might have leaned in just slightly, the way people do when they sense something important unfolding quietly, the kind of moment that makes you want to know what happens next, to stay, to listen, maybe even to tell someone else about it later. Richard tapped the table once with his finger, not impatient, but thoughtful, recalculating again, because the situation had evolved. Beyond a simple exchange, it had become a negotiation without terms, a test without clear rules, and that was unfamiliar territory. "And where do you stand in all this?" he asked finally, not as a challenge, but as a genuine attempt to understand the role she had chosen, or been forced, to play. Emily glanced briefly at the dining room, at the quiet movement of people unaware of the conversation unfolding in front of them, then back at him, her eyes steady. "Right here," she said, and there was something in the way she said it, something grounded, deliberate, as if this place, this moment, was not a step down from where she had been, but a position she had chosen for reasons he could not yet see. The tension did not break, it deepened, settling into something more complex, because now it was no longer about whether she understood the contract. It was about why she was here at all, and whether that answer, whatever it was, would change the outcome of everything that followed. Richard's eyes drifted back to the clause again, but this time, he was not reading it as a businessman looking for advantage. He was reading it as someone trying to understand how much he had already revealed without realizing it. Because there was something about the way Emily had responded, not just what she said, but how little she needed to say, that suggested she had seen this pattern before, not once, not twice, but enough times to recognize it instantly. He flipped the page back slowly, scanning earlier sections, and then it happened, a subtle shift in his expression, almost invisible unless you were watching closely, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a pause that lasted half a second too long, because buried near the top, in language most people would skim, was a structuring detail that had been part of a deal he closed months ago, one that had never been made public, one that should not have been recognizable to anyone outside a very small circle. His gaze lifted, sharper now, more focused than before. "This structure," he said carefully, tapping the page once. "It is familiar. Not an accusation, not yet, but close." Because familiarity in his world was never accidental. Emily did not react the way most people would when confronted with that kind of observation. There was no surprise, no denial, just a quiet stillness, as if she had been expecting this exact moment. And in that stillness, something became clearer, not fully, but enough to shift the weight of the conversation again. "It should be," she replied, her voice steady, almost neutral. "Patterns repeat when they work." And that answer, simple as it was, did not resolve anything. It deepened it, because it suggested knowledge without claiming ownership, awareness without explanation. Richard leaned back again, but this time the movement carried tension, controlled, but present, his mind moving quickly now, connecting pieces he had not needed to connect before, because until this moment, there had been no reason to question where this contract came from, who had drafted it, or why it felt so precisely tailored. But now, sitting across from someone who had not only recognized it, but anticipated its weaknesses, the equation no longer felt isolated. Across the room, a man in a navy suit glanced over again, sensing the shift without understanding it, the way people do when something important is happening quietly. And if you were there, you might have noticed it too, the way the air seemed to hold just a little tighter around that table. The way two people could sit across from each other and say so little, yet reveal so much, and you might have found yourself wondering, what is she not saying? What does he not yet see? Because moments like this do not happen without a reason. Richard's voice lowered slightly, not in volume, but in tone, more deliberate now. "You said you used to be on the other side," he said, watching her closely, "of tables like this." A pause, just enough to let the implication settle. What kind of cases? And this time, the question was not casual, it was specific, because he was no longer trying to place her in a category, he was trying to place her in a timeline. Emily's fingers moved away from the contract entirely now, resting lightly against the table, as if she no longer needed it as a reference, and when she answered, she did not rush, did not soften, did not avoid. "The kind where people think they are protected," she said, her eyes steady on his. "Until they are not." And there it was, not a full reveal, not yet, but a line drawn just clearly enough to suggest that whatever this moment was, it was connected to something larger, something that had already happened, and something that might not be over. Richard did not look away this time, not when she finished speaking, not when the silence stretched between them, because something in her last sentence had landed too precisely, like a memory he had not intended to revisit, and slowly, almost unconsciously, his fingers slid back to the top of the contract, tracing the structure again, not as a businessman, but as someone retracing a path he had already walked, protected. He repeated under his breath, and then his eyes shifted, not to her, but through her, as if aligning something in his mind, because months ago, there had been a case, quiet, contained, one that never reached headlines, one where the opposing counsel had come dangerously close to unraveling a deal that should have been airtight, a young attorney, sharp, methodical, someone who had noticed things others missed, someone who had almost forced a settlement that would have cost him more than money. His gaze snapped back to her, sharper now, the pieces no longer scattered but forming a pattern he could not ignore. You were there, he said, not a question anymore, his voice lower, controlled, but edged with realization, because the familiarity was no longer abstract, it was specific. Emily did not flinch, did not deny it. Instead, she reached for the contract again, not to take it, but to turn it slightly, aligning it with his perspective, as if inviting him to see what she had seen all along. You adjusted the language after that case, she said quietly, her finger resting near the clause he had thought buried well enough, but not enough. And that was it. The moment the entire situation shifted from possibility to certainty. Because she was not guessing, she was referencing. Richard felt it then, not as panic, but as clarity, the kind that arrives too late to be comfortable. Because this was no longer about a waitress who understood contracts. This was about someone who had been inside the exact kind of battle he had fought, someone who had studied his methods closely enough to recognize them in a single glance, and more importantly, someone who had not revealed that immediately, who had waited, observed, allowed him to walk himself into the realization step by step. The room seemed quieter now, or perhaps it was just that everything else had faded from his awareness, because in that moment, there were only two things that mattered, what she knew, and why she was here. Why here? He asked, the words more direct now, stripped of pretense, because the question was no longer about her past. It was about her presence, about the fact that someone with that level of insight had chosen, or ended up, in a place like this. Emily's expression softened, but only slightly, not with emotion, but with something closer to acceptance, as if this part of the conversation had always been inevitable. Because understanding people, she said, her voice steady, is easier when they do not think you matter. A pause, her eyes holding his without challenge, without fear, just truth. And you say more when you think you are being watched by no one. And that was the final turn. The realization that this had never been a simple encounter, never been just a test he initiated out of boredom, but something layered, something that had begun long before he sat down. Because she had not just recognized the contract, she had recognized him, his patterns, his assumptions, his need to control the narrative, and instead of confronting it, she had allowed it to unfold exactly as expected, until the moment it could no longer hold. And now, sitting across from her, Richard understood something he rarely allowed himself to admit. This was not the first move in the conversation. It was the last one, and he had not been the one making it. Richard did not reach for the contract again, not this time, because the paper no longer held the power it once did. It had become something else entirely, a reflection of a moment he could no longer control, and slowly, he leaned back in his chair, the tension in his posture easing not from comfort, but from acceptance, the kind that comes when a conclusion arrives without negotiation. His eyes moved from the document to the card, then finally to Emily, and for the first time since he sat down. There was no calculation behind his gaze, no strategy forming beneath the surface, just clarity, quiet and undeniable. You could have said all of this sooner, he said, not accusing, not defensive, just stating what now felt obvious, because if she had revealed who she was at the beginning, none of this would have unfolded the way it did. Emily picked up the card, sliding it back into her apron with the same calm precision she had shown from the start. You would not have listened, she replied simply, and there was no arrogance in her tone, no judgment, just truth, the kind that does not need to be proven because it already has been. Richard let out a small breath, almost a quiet laugh, not of amusement, but recognition, because she was right. He would have dismissed her, categorized her, controlled the conversation the way he always did, and in doing so, he would have missed everything that mattered. He glanced once more at the contract, then closed the folder, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a clean, deliberate motion that marked the end of something that had never really been about the paper in the first place. "So what happens now?" he asked, and the question carried more than curiosity. It carried a shift, a willingness to hear an answer he did not already expect. Emily stepped back slightly, creating a small distance between them, not as withdrawal, but as a return to balance, as if the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. "Now," she said, her voice steady, "you read what you sign." A brief pause, her eyes meeting his one last time. "And you stop assuming you are the smartest person in the room." The words were not harsh, not delivered with force, but they settled with a weight that did not need emphasis, because they were not meant to challenge him. They were meant to remain. Richard nodded